Okay, so this is Dan the Man Martin with DTM Chemistry Hacks. These are 10 things that I wish I knew uh, when I started to teach chemistry that I found out over years of teaching. I taught for 20 years, and uh, and I consider that process to be a continually learning process. When you teach, if the best way to go about it is to reflect on what you're doing all the time. You have different groups of students. Material changes over time. And so I think it's really super important to try to learn and be open to new techniques and to evaluate what you're doing critically and try to improve. And these are 10 things that I wish I knew when I first started. And then the first thing is I wish that I knew that you should probably start learning elements and symbols from day one and do them in very, very, very small chunks. What I typically would do would be to say, well, we're going to learn the group 1 elements first, the alkali metals. So the kids would start to memorize those early, just the names and symbols. You don't need to memorize anything else about the element. And as we did so, we talked about the properties of the elements and some of the things that they were used for and so forth. During various parts of my career, I did different types of activities to have the kids learn some practical applications of chemistry. And we did, one of the things that we did was a wanted poster for an element and, kind of put a reward, something about a value that the element had, maybe some harmful characteristics that the element had, and the element would be wanted for those harmful characteristics, or maybe the element was wanted because it could be used to be a semiconductor or something like that. And so that was one of the activities that we did as we were learning the elements. The second one, the second thing that I learned was that polyatomic ions are very, very difficult for kids to learn. And so out ahead of where they would need those for the nomenclature unit, naming chemical compounds, we started to learn those elements early, or those polyatomic ions and their names early. Name, charge, and symbols, right? And so that was the second revelation that I had, was we really need to start learning those early, do them in small chunks. All these things should be additive, however. And so, for example, with the group 1 elements, if you introduce the group 2 elements, the kids should know the group 1 elements as well when you evaluate them. And by learning these early, you also, when the material is not quite as difficult to master, you have things on there for kids to be successful, and you can teach them more things than just the basic concepts that you're covering in the first part of the class. The third thing I think is super important also is start doing labs and activities early. So I was fortunate enough that I had chemical laboratories that I could get the kids into and get them up off their feet and get them to tying physical events with theoretical concepts. And so I think that that's super important also. If you don't have a lab, if you're a homeschooler and that kind of thing, that's okay. You can get some resources to do home labs and that kind of thing. There's books of activities. A little bit later on, after I get the course launched and up and going, I'm going to work on some an activity series and a lab series, home labs that you can do with basic household chemicals like vinegar and baking soda and so forth. There's lots of cool labs that you can do with those. Having said that, you should also be very, very careful to always read and follow the safety instructions on any labs that you are doing. The fourth thing is to review things that you've covered earlier in the class, often. And so as you're going along, even though you can't be totally cumulative with your evaluations of your students, it would just overwhelm them, I think, anyway. You can have small segments or small review sessions and then include those in your evaluation. For example, when you get to maybe the part about naming chemical compounds, well, you might go back and review significant figures, or you might go back and review the scientific method. And you should be doing that in the laboratory as well. And maybe not go into as much depth as you did at the first, but have some quick reviews and also include those in your evaluation and hold your students accountable for those. Otherwise, they'll tend to tune you out. So that brings up the fifth point here: is progress is more important than performance. All right. So you have all sorts of different types of students in your classroom. If you're a homeschooler, your kid, your child that you're working with may be more talented in certain areas than others. And don't emphasize the grade. I've learned going through school, I've spent a lot of time in school. Some of the classes that I made a B and a C in, I learned a lot more in those classes than classes I made A's in. And so emphasize learning instead of marks on a paper. When you get out in the world, they really won't care what marks you made. They'll care about how much you know and how well you can perform. So emphasize learning always. Okay. Number 6, create a sense of urgency. All right. So people are human. Students are human. So if you don't create some goals in mind in terms of how much material that you're going to cover, students will drag their feet in learning it. There's no other way of putting it. If if they can put it off till tomorrow, they will. And so you've got to create a sense of urgency in your classroom, or your students will get bored. The ones that are catching on quickly will get bored that you're covering something to death that everybody, 90% of the people have gotten. So go after it, create a sense of urgency. Also, you need to keep in mind if people aren't getting it, if I don't know what number you have in mind in terms of having the kids master something in the class, but you can't wait till everybody gets it. Now, if you're a homeschooler, that's totally different, but you still need to create a sense of urgency with your kid and have them, if they're not getting it, you need to spend extra time on it, work a little bit harder, and maybe get some additional resources available, and really create that sense of urgency. That way you can progress in the class and cover the things you need to cover. Number 7, and to go along with this, know your students, right? And that's something that was always emphasized in the schools that I was at. Get to know your students, know what they're interested in, know what their strengths and weaknesses are. They always say somebody doesn't care how much you know until you demonstrate how much you care, right, about them as a person. And so I always told the kids, I don't care if you're making a D or if you're making an A, I love you all the same. You're my caring about you and my relationship with you has nothing to do with how well you're performing in my class. It just doesn't. And so that's one of those things that I think educators do a great job of. And I'm sure if you're homeschooling your child, you love your child and you want them to do the very best that they can. And if they're not performing well, being disappointed in them might actually hinder their learning. And so you've got to know your kid. I coached tennis for years, and so I know that every kid is different in terms of what they need to perform well and to have a well-rounded experience. Okay. Number 8, preview content that will be taught later. All right. So there's no harm in maybe doing a demonstration or talking about a subject that you're going to cover in along down the line in the class, maybe later once the kids have the skills to handle it. And so I think that just gets kids excited. And we always talk about the teachable moment, right? And so don't get so focused on the content that you're covering that you can't go off the path a little bit and talk about something that maybe somebody's interested in that you're going to cover later. And that just creates a sense of joy and fun. I think one of the harmful things about education is that we don't take time to really explore the things that students are really interested in. And so you've got to stay with it. You got to create a sense of urgency, but you've also got to walk that balance where you can talk about some other things that kids are interested in as well. And I think that just creates a good atmosphere. Okay, number 9. This is one that you have to be careful with. Certain topics need to be covered in order. Okay, you can't learn to name chemical compounds if you don't know the elements. You can't do gas law stoichiometry problems before you've done stoichiometry. Okay, but there are certain things that you can kind of learn as you go along. The periodic table is a great one. We have a unit on the periodic table, periodic trends and organization and history of the table and all that. But when you're talking about atomic structure, it's natural to talk about the periodic table, right? And so my kids, before they got to the periodic table unit, had covered a lot of the concepts in that periodic table unit or chapter that we were covering, and that's fine. There are other things that you can talk about as well, and talk about a little bit in depth, maybe not as much depth as when you get to them, like when you talk about polyatomic ions. Well, it's natural to talk about what an ion is, right? Even though you haven't talked about ions and isotopes and those sorts of things yet in the class, but you can say, well, this, since it's negatively charged, it has gained an electron. All those elements in that compound have gained electrons. Or if it's a positive ion, they've lost electrons, right? And so you need to be careful about order, but you also need to have in mind that you can preview things that are coming and talk about them in a little less depth. And then when you get to that unit, you can dig down on it and make sure that you have a good, thorough understanding. The students have a good, thorough understanding of what's going on there. All right. And then number 10. All right. Number 10 says, make some videos. All right. So you may be thinking, well, he is saying that you need videos because he's selling videos. And that's partially true. But at the very end of my career, the last 3 years, I had videos for my kids to watch. And even if you don't purchase my videos, find some video lessons for the kids. You may have to dig through the internet to find them. They're really easy to find here because I've got videos for each unit in a typical chemistry course. But what that allows you to do is, if somebody has missed school or coming into your class late, or if they're having trouble getting tutoring on a certain subject, you have a really good resource for the kid to grab a hold of. And there's a lot of things going on in your classroom. A lot of them you don't even know are going on. And sometimes kids find it very hard to focus. Yourself, when you've been taking classes somewhere, you just may not be there that day. And then when you're dealing with teenagers, that is absolutely true. There may be something going on with with a relationship, with a job, with a sport, with an activity, and they're thinking about that instead of listening to you, and that's perfectly natural. And then if a kid just is not there physically or mentally, they can go back and review those lessons. They can pause them and take additional notes. Some people just have a really hard time writing and thinking at the same time. I know I do sometimes, and so that is a very, very, very useful thing to have, is some videos for kids to watch and to review. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my 10 chemistry hacks. I've enjoyed thinking about those things that I would tell a young teacher. And then it's not only young teachers, but people who have taught for years and maybe are looking for some ideas to improve. I think if you're an experienced teacher and you learned one thing from this presentation, it's been well worth your while. I knew when I did professional development, a lot of times they were presenting things that I was already doing or didn't think worked so well. But I always look for that one thing, that one idea that I could use to help improve my teaching. And for you homeschoolers, I hope this was very helpful to you as well, and gave you some ideas on how to progress through a typical high school chemistry course. Thanks for paying attention. Peace. I hope that I am providing good value for you in your in my lessons. Thanks.